The great hall of the royal palace was filled with voices and footsteps. Tall stone walls stretched high above, banners of red and gold hanging from every corner. A long carpet ran down the middle, leading to the throne where the king and queen sat in silence. Rows of nobles, generals, and knights lined both sides, each waiting for the moment that would decide the future. The young Princess Claire Morgan stood at the center, her bright eyes moving slowly across the hall. This day had been spoken of for months. It was the day she would choose someone to stand by her side, a companion who would share in the duty of protecting the kingdom. Many believed she would pick a noble knight with polished armor, or a son of a rich family who could offer wealth. Everyone expected a grand choice, one that would strengthen alliances and secure power. Among the people gathered, there was a man who never thought he belonged in this place. His name was Ethan Cole. He was not a knight, not a noble, and not a man with great land or riches. He had been invited by mistake, or so he thought. His plain clothing and quiet manner made him invisible among the shining armor and bright jewels of the others. He kept to the side of the hall, hoping no one would notice him. The air grew tense when the king raised his hand. His voice carried through the hall with calm strength as he told his daughter to choose. Claire stepped forward, her gown sweeping softly behind her. Dozens of men stood taller, each certain that they would be the one. Act. Their hands rested on the hilts of their swords, their faces proud and confident. But Claire's eyes did not stop on them. She looked past the polished armor and the proud smiles. She searched the crowd until her gaze fell on Ethan, who stood near the wall, unsure of what to do. For a moment, the hall seemed to fall silent. She lifted her hand and pointed at him. Her voice was clear, carrying across the room so that every soul could hear. "I picked this human." The words struck the air like a bell. Shock moved through the hall at once. The nobles whispered to each other, some laughing in disbelief, others frowning with confusion. The generals exchanged quick glances, certain they had misheard her. The king's face froze in surprise, his hand gripping the armrest of his throne. Ethan's chest tightened as all eyes turned to him. His mouth opened, but no words came out. He could not understand why she had chosen him. He wanted to disappear, to step back into the shadows and leave the hall. But Claire's gaze did not waver. She looked at him with steady confidence, as if she had seen something that no one else could. One of the nobles stepped forward, his voice sharp. He asked the princess why she would pick a man with no title, no army, and no name of worth. Another noble added his anger, saying the kingdom needed strength, not weakness. Still, Claire did not turn her eyes away from Ethan. The queen's voice rose, gentle but firm, asking her daughter to explain. Claire's answer was simple. She said she did not care for riches or titles. She wanted someone who was honest and true, someone who would not hide behind empty words or greed. She said she saw this in Ethan, even though he had nothing to offer but himself. Ethan could not move. His heart raced, his thoughts spinning in a storm of doubt. He was no warrior, no leader. He did not belong in this place of crowns and swords. Yet the princess had chosen him, and no one could change that choice. The king finally spoke, his deep voice filling the hall again. He did not hide his anger, but he did not break his daughter's will. He said if Ethan was to stand by the princess, then he would have to prove his worth through trials that no man could take lightly. Only then would the kingdom accept him. The nobles nodded, their pride untouched, certain that Ethan would fail. The hall began to clear, voices rising in argument and laughter. But Claire remained still, her eyes calm, her hand resting at her side. She watched Ethan, and when no one else was looking, she gave him the smallest smile, as if to tell him not to fear. Ethan stood frozen, caught between fear and wonder. The world had shifted in one moment, and he did not know where it would lead. But he knew this much. The princess had chosen him, and nothing would ever be the same again. The days after the choice were filled with questions and whispers. Ethan Cole could not walk through the palace without feeling the weight of every glance. Servants lowered their voices when he passed. Guards gave him long stares, some filled with doubt, others with quiet laughter. Right. The nobles barely hid their scorn. To them he was an intruder, a mistake in the perfect order of royal life. Ethan spent much of his time in silence, unsure of where he belonged. He had been given a room in the palace, larger and finer than any place he had ever slept before, yet he felt no comfort inside it. The heavy curtains, the polished floors, and the gold carvings all felt strange to him. He missed the small home he had left behind, the simple bed, the sound of the wind outside the window. Still, he could not turn away. The princess had chosen him, and the king had demanded he prove himself. There was no path backward. Each morning he was called to the training yard, where soldiers in shining armor waited. The captain, a stern man named Nathan Gray, greeted him with a hard expression. Nathan had trained hundreds of men, but never one like Ethan. The first trial began with sword practice. Ethan held the weapon awkwardly, the weight pulling at his arm. The soldiers around him smirked as his swings missed their marks. His hands burned with blisters and sweat poured down his face. Each fall to the ground was met with laughter, but Ethan stood up again and again, refused to let the sword slip from his hand. Princess Claire watched from the edge of the yard, her hands folded before her. She never spoke a word, never gave advice or command. Yet her eyes stayed fixed on Ethan. Every time he stumbled, he saw her watching, and something inside him pushed him to rise once more. After days of sword drills, Nathan moved him to archery. The bow was lighter than the sword, yet the string cut into Ethan's fingers until they bled. His first arrows flew far from the target. His second set landed in the dirt, but little by little, he learned to steady his hands. When one arrow finally struck the outer edge of the target, a few soldiers raised their brows, surprised at his slow but steady progress. The last part of the trial was not strength or skill, but mind. Nathan gathered the men and set before Ethan a table covered in maps and wooden figures. He asked Ethan to place the figures as if defending a village from an attack. The other soldiers whispered among themselves, sure he would fail. Yet Ethan leaned forward, studying the map with quiet focus. He remembered his own home, the narrow paths, the bridges, the small river that curved around it. He thought about how he would protect it if enemies came. Instead of copying the formations of great generals, he placed the figures where they could use the land itself for defense. He spoke with calm words, explaining why farmers with bows could guard the fields, why hunters who knew the forest could strike from the shadows. At first the soldiers laughed, but as Ethan continued, the hall grew quiet. His plan was strange but clever, simple yet strong. Even Nathan found himself nodding, though he did not say it aloud. When the trial ended, Ethan was exhausted. His body ached, his hands shook, and he longed for rest. Yet Princess Claire stepped forward and spoke with a clear voice. She told the gathered men that Ethan had shown more than strength. He had shown patience, courage, and thought. She reminded them that true power was not in armor or gold, but in the will to stand again after every fall. Some soldiers still shook their heads, but others looked at Ethan differently now. Their eyes no longer carried only doubt. A few even gave him small nods of respect. It was not much, but it was enough to keep him moving forward. That night, Ethan sat by the window of his room, staring at the stars above the palace towers. His hands were raw, his muscles sore, yet his heart carried a new weight. He did not know if he could win the trials still to come, but he knew he could no longer think of himself as invisible. The princess had chosen him, and in that choice she had given him something he never expected: hope. The palace grew restless as news spread of danger beyond the borders. Messengers arrived breathless, carrying word of an enemy kingdom, gathering strength. Villages at the edge of the land spoke of soldiers marching, weapons shining under the sun. Though the threat had not yet reached the capital, fear moved through the halls like a cold wind. Ethan Cole heard these whispers as he trained each morning. The soldiers spoke more sharply, their voices edged with worry. Even Captain Nathan grew more severe, driving the men harder, his eyes clouded with thought. Ethan did not ask questions, but he listened, and every word sank into his mind. He understood that the kingdom stood on the edge of war. The nobles used this fear to attack him. In the council chamber, they spoke loudly against the princess's choice. They said the kingdom needed a strong warrior, not a common man with no past and no name. They urged the king to set aside his daughter's words and replace Ethan with a general. Their arguments filled the air day after day, heavy and sharp like iron, yet Claire stood tall. She faced her father, and the council was steady calm. She said that Ethan had not failed his trials, that he had shown a strength different from what they expected. She reminded them that battles were not won only with swords, but with heart and mind. Many shook their heads, yet none could break her will. Ethan himself felt the weight of doubt pressing on him. Alone at night, he thought of leaving the palace, of slipping away into the dark streets and returning to the life he once knew. He feared he would bring ruin to the princess if he stayed. But each morning when he entered the yard, he saw Claire watching him. Her eyes carried trust, and he could not walk away from that. One evening, Nathan approached Ethan after training. The captain's voice was low, stripped of the sharp tone he often carried. He told Ethan that the enemy would soon strike, and the kingdom would need every man ready. He said Ethan's strength was not in his sword, but in his way of seeing the world.
8.
Nathan admitted that the soldiers had begun to notice it, even if they did not speak it aloud. His words were few, but they left Ethan standing still long after the captain had gone. As the threat grew, the palace prepared for defense. Walls were reinforced, gates repaired, and supplies stored in hidden rooms. The soldiers sharpened blades until sparks flew in the night. The sound of hammers echoed through the courtyards as armor was mended and shields repaired. Fear was present, but so was resolve. Ethan was called to join the soldiers in planning. At first he felt out of place among men who had spent their lives studying war. But when the maps were spread across the tables and the generals argued over strategies, Ethan listened closely. He saw flaws in their plans, paths left unguarded, rivers ignored, forests forgotten. When he spoke, his words were simple, but clear. Some generals scoffed, but Nathan told them to listen. Slowly, grudgingly they did. Claire often visited these meetings, standing beside Ethan without speaking for him. Let his voice carry its own weight, though her presence gave him strength. The bond between them grew, not spoken in words, but shown in trust. Others began to notice, though few dared to say it aloud. One night, while the hall outside was quiet, Claire found Ethan alone by the window. The city lay below them, its lights glowing like stars fallen to earth. She asked him if he feared the coming war. Ethan did not deny it. He said he was afraid, but he would not run. He told her that if she could believe in him, then he would fight with everything he had. Claire smiled softly at his answer. She said that was all she ever wanted from him. Not perfection, not power, only the will to stand when others would fall. For the first time since her choice, Ethan felt a calm strength rise in him. The days passed and the warning bells finally rang. Messengers arrived with reports that the enemy had crossed the border. The kingdom braced itself, the people gathering behind walls, the soldiers readying for battle. Ethan stood among them, no longer the quiet shadow in the hall, but a man chosen by the princess herself. He did not know if he was ready, but he knew this: he would not turn away. The sound of horns filled the air as the enemy army came into sight. Dust rose on the horizon, where countless boots struck the earth in rhythm. The people of the capital stood on the walls, eyes wide with fear, while soldiers tightened their grips on shields and spears. The sun burned above, casting long shadows that stretched toward the city gates. Ethan Cole stood among the soldiers, the weight of armor heavy on his shoulders. His sword hung at his side, unfamiliar but steady in his hand. He could hear his heart racing, louder than the horns, louder than the marching outside, yet he did not step back. He looked at the men beside him and they looked back, waiting for someone to speak. Captain Nathan gave the order to hold formation, his voice sharp as steel. But when silence followed, Ethan raised his voice. He reminded the soldiers of the plan they had built together. He told them that the walls were strong, the gates were ready, and that courage mattered more than fear. His words were plain, but they carried strength. Some men nodded, and the fear in their eyes lessened. Princess Claire appeared on horseback, dressed in armor of silver and blue. Gasps ran through the ranks, for no princess had ever ridden to the front lines before. She lifted her sword high so the sunlight caught its edge, and her voice rang clear. She said they would not fight for pride or riches, but for their homes, their families, and their future. Her presence brought fire to the men, and when she lowered her sword, their cheers rose like thunder. The enemy struck first. Arrows darkened the sky, hissing as they fell against the shields of the defenders. The walls shook as heavy rams pounded against the gates, as the air filled with smoke and dust, the clash of steel echoing like storm winds. Ethan fought as the plan demanded, moving with the soldiers to hold the weakest points. When a section of wall came under heavy attack, Ethan led a group of archers to higher ground. He guided their aim, telling them to fire not at the strongest, but at the leaders who pushed the enemy forward, their order breaking for moments at a time. Nathan saw this and shouted for a charge. The defenders pushed down from the walls with renewed strength, forcing the attackers back. But the battle was far from over. The enemy found a narrow path through the forest near the city, and a wave of soldiers poured toward the flank. Messengers cried out warnings, and panic spread as defenders rushed to meet them. Ethan realized this was the moment that could break the kingdom. He did not wait for orders. He gathered a small band of men and moved quickly toward the forest. Claire saw him leaving and rode to join him. Ethan begged her to stay behind, but she shook her head. She said she would not let him face the danger alone. Together they led the group into the trees, where shadows twisted and branches clawed at their armor. The enemy advanced with loud cries, but Ethan's mind worked fast, ordered the men to use the terrain. They knocked down trees to block the narrow path, turning the enemy's numbers into a weakness. Archers climbed the branches and fired from above, while soldiers struck from the sides. The forest became a trap, and the enemy struggled to move forward. Claire fought beside Ethan, her sword flashing in the dim light. She moved with grace and courage, never once falling back. The clash lasted for hours. Sweat and blood marked every soldier, but slowly the enemy line began to crumble. Ethan gave one final order to push forward, and the defenders surged with a cry. The enemy broke, retreating through the forest in chaos. When silence finally fell, only the groans of the wounded remained. As the sun dipped low, the horns of retreat echoed from the enemy camp. Their attack had failed, and the capital still stood. On the walls, soldiers lifted their swords and shouted in victory. Nathan saluted Ethan from afar, his respect clear for the first time. Ethan stood with Claire at the edge of the forest, both breathing hard, their armor stained, but their spirits unbroken. The kingdom had survived its darkest trial, not because of wealth or titles, because ordinary people had stood together and fought with heart. Ethan looked at Claire, and she met his eyes with quiet strength. The battle was won, but both knew the war was not yet over. What lay ahead would test them even more, but for this moment. They had proven that choice and courage could shape the fate of a kingdom. The night after the battle was heavy with silence. Fires burned low across the courtyards where wounded men lay, their faces pale but alive. Families came to the walls with food and water, their voices soft with thanks. For the first time in many days, the capital slept with hope instead of fear. Ethan Cole walked through the palace halls, his body sore, his armor scratched, yet his spirit stronger than it had ever been. He had never thought of himself as a leader, yet men now stopped him to offer words of respect. Some clasped his arm, others bowed their heads slightly as he passed. These were the same soldiers who once laughed at him, and now they looked at him with pride. Princess Claire moved beside him, her steps calm though her body bore marks of the fight. She did not speak of her own bravery, nor did she take the praise for herself. When people thanked her, she only said that the kingdom had stood together, that no one person had won the battle. Still, many eyes followed her, for they saw in her both strength and kindness. In the throne room the king called a gathering. The nobles arrived in fine robes, their faces stiff, their pride wounded by what had happened. They had argued against Claire's choice, and they had doubted Ethan, but the victory could not be denied. The king sat high on his throne, his gaze sweeping across the hall until it stopped on Ethan. He spoke in a voice that carried to every corner. He said that Ethan had been tested not only with sword and bow, but with heart and mind. He said that Ethan had stood when others doubted him, and that he had defended the kingdom with courage no gold could buy. The hall was silent, the nobles bowing their heads, unable to argue. Then the king turned to his daughter. He asked her if she still stood by her choice. Claire's answer was steady. She said yes, she would stand by Ethan as long as breath filled her. She said that her trust in him had never wavered, and that she believed his presence had saved them all. The king paused, then rose from his throne. He declared before all that Ethan Cole was no longer a common man of the kingdom. He was to be honored as the chosen companion of the princess, with the respect and duty that came with it. The hall erupted in voices, some shocked, some cheering, but no one dared to challenge the words of the king. Ethan stood frozen, his heart pounding. He had never wanted power or titles. He had only wished to live a quiet life, but now the kingdom itself looked to him as a symbol of hope. When he turned his eyes to Claire, she gave him a small nod, and that was all he needed. Days turned into weeks, and the kingdom slowly healed. Farmers returned to their fields, children played in the streets, and the walls were repaired stronger than before. The threat of war still lingered beyond the borders, but the people no longer feared as they once had. They had seen that courage could rise from unexpected places, and they believed in it. Ethan and Claire spent their time walking among the people, speaking not as rulers above, but as companions beside them. Ethan listened to the worries of villagers, offering simple words and practical help. Claire worked to bring aid to those who had lost homes, her presence a comfort to all. Together they became a pair the people trusted, not because of crowns or titles, but because they cared. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills, Ethan stood on the balcony of the palace. The city below glowed with lantern light, voices carrying in warmth through the night air. Claire joined him, her gown brushing softly across the stones. For a while they said nothing, simply watching the life of the kingdom they had fought for. At last Ethan spoke. He said he still did not understand why she had chosen him that day in the hall. Claire smiled, her eyes bright in the fading light. She told him that sometimes the heart saw what the eyes could not. She said she had not chosen him for what he was, but for what she believed he could become. Ethan felt the weight of her words, and for the first time he no longer questioned them. He knew that the path ahead would not be easy, but he also knew that together they could face whatever came. The bells of the city rang in the distance, their sound rolling through the night. People cheered from the streets, celebrating not just victory but a new beginning. Ethan looked out over them, no longer the quiet man hiding in the shadows of the hall, but a figure who carried the trust of a kingdom. The journey that began with a single choice had grown into something greater than either of them had imagined. And as the stars rose high above, Ethan knew that this was only the beginning of their story.